Hello again, everyone. Welcome back. John Flynn here from Flynn Real Estate, serving Southern Ontario, based out of the Niagara region. So, some analysts, according to our CBC state broadcaster, suggest that people need to spend more than 30% of their income on housing, whether it's getting a second job or spending less money elsewhere. This is kind of the new narrative or suggestions from some people that I guess the CBC chooses to interview. Check out this article here from July 2nd. As housing costs soar, some financial analysts advise to scrap the 30% rule. So right now there's a 30% benchmark kind of rule, and it does carry over into ratios when you're getting approved for mortgages with banks. But again, they say you should spend no more than 30% of your income on housing or on rent or whatever the case may be. The benchmark doesn't apply anymore, said Credit Canada CEO Bruce Sellery by email. Is that the guy's real last name? Seller with a Y at the end? Housing costs have increased dramatically everywhere, and so individuals need to look at their own specific situation and determine how to best allocate limited resources. So they're kind of laying the groundwork to say, like, well, it's up to people, and every situation is different. So we need to, again, scrap this 30% benchmark rule and maybe look at other options. The Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation began adopting the rule in 1986. The 30% threshold continues to be a useful benchmark to consistently measure housing affordability in Canada and other parts of the world, including in the United States and Australia, CMHC said in an email. However, the corporation says it introduced the housing hardship concept in 2020 to acknowledge that for some households, keeping the cost to 30% of their budget still isn't enough to cover all their essential needs. So of course, with inflation, they've had to kind of introduce new measures and kind of tweak the rules a bit. The answer, according to finance specialists like Ann Arbor, I'm still waiting for the analysts because the title said analysts to some analysts, right? So anyway, let's keep reading. Director of Strategic Partnerships and Education at the Credit Counseling Society is to ditch the 30% rule, taking into consideration that these people are not working with the big banks or the Bank of Canada. They're working for other subsets within the industry. In today's age of inflation and very high housing costs, it isn't always attainable. Arbor says the 30% rule used to be the 25% rule when she first studied economics 1,000 years ago, and she wouldn't be surprised if it continued to creep higher. So Ann Arbor from Canada is quoted as saying she used to study this 1,000 years ago. So she's over 1,000 years old, supposedly. And lastly, this is the key takeaway from the whole article, and probably something you should be somewhat concerned about. And this is from another specialist they called in. His last name is Bridge, and he says, for those struggling to keep their budget in order, he recommends they examine their spending. Usually the first things to go will be discretionary items like eating out. Expenses like rent aren't as pliable, Bridge says, although it is possible to cut costs by getting a roommate or to make more money getting a second job. So there you have it. They recommend getting a second job or a third job, Uber, skip the dishes, whatever the case may be. And maybe don't eat out as much. Don't spend as much time with your family. Just work more and you'll be able to afford a house. Seems like a great idea there from these specialists or analysts or whatever the case may be. Anyway, let's move on. I'm not going to get into the stats across the country this week because the long weekend, there's a lot of places that didn't report. But this next chart I want to talk about, it is closely related to this article or the theme of the article there. And this is just a general price chart of yearly average prices from Ontario or ITSO, the surrounding GTA areas. And I just wanted to point out back 2013, 2014, 2015, you could go and you could buy a house, or an investor could buy a house, or a speculator, and you could rent it out. You could cover the cost of that house and even maybe some maintenance, depending on how much you put down. But that was normal. Like, you buy a single family home or a new construction and you rent it out, and it's an investment, right? You keep it long term. And then you can see as we approach 2017, 2018, 2019, it got a lot harder to do. I remember people buying new construction in my area, and I'm thinking, like, what are these people insane? You're not going to be able to rent it out for what your costs or what your expenses are, even with 20% down. But it didn't matter because rents started to increase, or they kept increasing a little bit more than usual, but they were breaking even for the most part. Some weren't, but most of them were. That's also the time when people decided to start Airbnb-ing. Maybe they weren't making enough. Maybe they weren't covering their costs on people because they had HELOCs from the down payment and they were paying for that too. So they said, okay, let's do some Airbnb. So this is kind of when Airbnb really started to take off with investors, especially in my area, but many of the areas in Ontario. And then you got to 2021, 2022, and even today. Investors today, you can't go buy a house and rent it out. Like you're not even going to come close to making your payments. So you have to either put another unit in there or you do the Airbnb, but we all know the Airbnb now is, not doing as well as it was. Profits are down 40% to 50%, depending on where you live. And it's pretty much flooded the market or oversaturated with too many investors doing this. So what do you do now? You rent it out to students. And I've seen some people on social media saying, this is what you do. You buy the house and you put so many bedrooms in it or bunk beds and you rent it out to students. So within a decade, we've gone from buying a single family home pretty much anywhere, renting it out and cover your costs, to coming up with these creative ways. So the next step now is to rent it out to students. What comes after this? Who knows? Your guess is as good as mine. Let me know in the comments what you think. But I'm thinking probably more student rentals. We already know people are working second and third jobs to cover the costs of these investments or primary residences. So that's really not an option. That previous article was for just normal end users that are going to have to do this. But the investors, a lot of them are doing this. So I don't know what comes after this. We'll see. I think the easy solution is that the economy goes into recession, prices come down, and affordability returns at some point. Other people think, no, prices will never come down, but I want to know, okay, if they don't come down, what's the solution? Just a few more charts before I go. This is the average percent of last original list price, what our place is selling for in relation to the original list price, not the relisted or new price, whatever the case may be. So I just wanted to point out, again, this is ITSO, all the 20 boards surrounding the GTA. You can see in 2021, in June, these are all June, it was 107%. Market was very strong. And even in that year, I think it was February and March was the strongest months. But regardless, the market was strong. Last year, we were in free fall in June. If anyone remembers, we were clearly in free fall in these areas in Ontario. And places were still selling for 100.4%. And this was because people were still listing low and getting over asking because they've artificially put the price low to get multiple offers. So this year, which we had an amazing spring for sellers, some say we reached the bottom in January and it's only up from here, which I disagree, obviously. But compared to last year, when the market was in free fall, we're less than we were last year. You could say, okay, it's not that far off, but we're very similar. Again, these are artificially inflated percentages because people are listing low and they're getting over asking price because they've put the house 100,000 or 150,000 below asking. Now that's all changed, obviously, in June, but the remnants were still there probably for the first week or two. Here was the sales. Now I pointed out these are the sales monthly. So of course they spike in the spring always. And you can see where we are, the black line down there. This was June, the last point on this chart. And the last time in June we had sales this low was back in 2011. It's been 12 years since we've had sales numbers this low in June in this area. So that's pretty significant. So, you might have thought listings were low, but sales are also very low. And it's been a while since they've been this low. And lastly, the months of supply in the same areas has returned to 2015 levels and this is any month. Months of supply have not been this high since 2011. And you can see historically, we're still low, but it has returned to a 2015 level, which is pretty significant. So anyway, that's it for this week. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.